Well, I could speak in English as well, and then maybe you can speak in Italian. Yeah, yeah. He knows a little bit of Italian, you know. Well, thank you very much for being here. My name is Federico Spoletti. I'm a co-founder of two companies called Subti and Subti Access, which are a partner of the Torino short film market, and we are also offering 2 awards that will be delivered tomorrow night. And these 2 companies work in the field of accessibility in a broad sense, linguistic accessibility, which means making a film accessible to foreign audiences, subtitles in our particular case, and it was founded in 2002. So in the last almost 20 years, we've been translated films in almost any language, from any language into any language. And then the younger sister is called Subti Access. It's a company based in Torino and deals with accessibility, cultural accessibility, meaning making audiovisual content, not only theater as well, also lessons of educational environments, or anyway, to make content, audiovisual content and information available to audiences with sensory impairment, visual or hearing impairment, which means subtitling for the deaf or hard of hearing, if you're deaf, or in the case of visual impairments or blindness, creating an audio comment, audio description, which gives you the possibility to experience as much as possible a film, or anyway a piece of content, cultural content, in a way as much as possible similar to the way as it is experienced by let's say, people who doesn't have this problem. And we've been trying in the last few years to raise awareness about the fact that half of the audiences, more or less, of films are seen by people who see them in another language. So the aspect of translation, definitely accessibility also, but translation is important if you think that a filmmaker spends a lot of time, possibly years, in developing a project, and then apparently is not really involved in the translation process. It's like they don't really care about what happened in the distribution phase. The way how the industry is structured at the moment is that translation is relegated to the distribution, which means that usually subtitles are done in a very short time from people that doesn't have any connection at all with the creative team. And the result is that possibly there is a poor quality, and also possibly the way foreign audiences see or understand your film is very different from the way the original, the audience who knows the original language knows. And so we have been supported a new notion, let's say, or center of study that was founded in the UK, which is called Accessible Filmmaking, where the idea is trying to integrate translation and accessibility since the inception of a project. So not in the end of the chain, but from the beginning, in a way to make also filmmakers aware of what the problems are. And of course, if a filmmaker decides for a particular kind of editing, subtitles can be more difficult, or anyway, if you read the subtitle, you're not able to realize that certain choices have been taken. And this is more or less what Josh is going to talk today. Josh is one of the experts of accessible filmmaking. He is a part of a research study at the University of Roehampton in London, and he's doing a PhD in Vigo in Spain, and he has a BA in modern languages and translation, so he knows what he's doing. And most of all, he's not only an academic, but also works on set, so he really tried to activate this accessible filmmaking thing, working side by side with the production team. So that's why I thought it was particularly important to have you here. Josh Branson, connected with Tom Branson from Downton Abbey? No. Okay, the floor is yours.
I'll take this. Thanks. So first of all, good afternoon. Thank you very much to Federico and to Subti for inviting me, and to the short film market for having me here. As Federico said, I'm doing a PhD. It's actually at Roehampton in London, and I'm also a subtitler. And Federico's kind of set things up quite nicely there, so I'm going to talk to you about access and translation, and more specifically this concept of accessible filmmaking, which looks at ways in which filmmakers can integrate access and translation into the filmmaking process through collaboration with translation and media access professionals, such as subtitlers, dubbers, audio describers. So I think this quote here by Etam Egoyan and Ian Buffor really kind of speaks to the idea of accessible filmmaking, and in particular in the way that it kind of evokes this idea of multiplicity and a consideration of multiple audiences, the idea that every film in some way is often, or if not always, seen by different audiences, and that's potentially something worth considering. So I'm going to kind of talk about 4 different aspects, if you like, of this collaborative process today. I'm going to start with a bit of history of film translation and look at the way in which film can be and has been kind of, that translation has been integral to filmmaking in the past, and just invoke some of that history. And then I'll talk about the way in which kind of research reveals to us how we watch films, both kind of prior to and after a translation. And then I'll start talking about accessible filmmaking. And finally, I'd like to discuss a kind of pilot study that I've worked on as part of the PhD, working on an Italian short film that I hope will give you a sense of how this kind of works in practice, some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities. So I think Federico's given us a good kind of overview there of what media access is, but I've just got 2 short clips in case anyone is kind of new to the world of media access or accessibility. So the first one, I think, is, these are the subtitles for viewers with hearing impaired, so I'll just play this for you.
I had a tape recorder, of course. I had cassettes. Is that the microphone? Yes. Is it on? That makes a difference, doesn't it? Testing, testing, testing. Today is Tuesday, and I'm wondering if this machine will record or not. Testing, testing. Today is Tuesday, and I'm wondering if this machine will record or not.
Okay, so as you can see, there's also kind of descriptions of the soundtrack there for deaf or hearing impaired viewers. And I'll now just show you a quick clip of an audio description in case some of you are unfamiliar with that.
The wake of a ferryboat froths and foams. The screen returns to black. Captions. In 1983, after years of deteriorating vision, John Hull went completely blind. For the next 3 years, he kept a diary on audio cassette. This film is a dramatisation, using his original recordings. John stands with his son by the ship's rail, the little boy's hand clasped in his.
When did you get blind?
John blurred in an ultrasound clinic, a fetus pictured on the monitor.
It happened just a few days before you were born.
Back on the ship, the boy swims into focus.
What made your eyes go poorly?
Sunspots swirl.
They were sick and the doctors couldn't make them better.
The ship's wake churns. From darkness, a slow drift down underwater. And back to black. Notes on blindness.
Okay, so I hope that gives you a bit of insight into those kind of two modes of media access there. I would just like to stress, though, that these services, although they were kind of traditionally created, intended for audience with hearing impairments, they are in fact used by a kind of variety of viewers and used for kind of different reasons. So it might be viewers with cognitive impairments, or viewers who are learning other languages, or even people that are multitasking. So we're kind of moving away from this definition of media access that is kind of defined by its viewers in such a kind of strict sense. I just have a quick question for the audience here. I'd just like to know whether any of you here as filmmakers have had an opportunity to work directly with translators before, or subtitlers, audio describers, dubbers. Has anyone had that experience as a filmmaker? Yeah? Okay, interesting, great, thanks. So, moving on. One of the biggest talking points over the last 12 months, at least in film translation circles, has been Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, and I'm sure some of you will also know that there was a fair bit of controversy when Netflix decided to subtitle the film's Mexican Spanish into Iberian Spanish for audiences in Spain, which was viewed as a patronizing and offensive kind of act, not only because the subtitles were deemed sort of unnecessary in that Spaniards understand Mexican Spanish, but also due to the fact that various words were changed in the subtitles, the most baffling perhaps being the substitution of the word mama in the Mexican version to madre in Spanish. And while Cuarón himself was actually involved in the English language subtitling, he worked in collaboration with the English language subtitle, and we can discuss that a bit later. He was totally unaware of the decision that Netflix made to subtitle his film into Spanish, and he was rather upset when he found out about it. So we have a situation here where the film director is not informed about the treatment of his film in translation, and there's an apparent lack of communication between the director and certain kind of translation professionals, or you might say the distributor in this case, which led to kind of several issues. But that's not to say that this is always the case today. And in fact, there are plenty of film directors who are working closely with translators and who kind of insist on working in very close ways with translators. And notable contemporary examples would be Steven Soderbergh, Quentin Tarantino, and Alejandro González Iñárritu. And nor was this necessarily the case in the past. So, if we look back at the history of cinema, we discover actually that translation has always played an integral role in film, and that filmmakers were often involved in these translational practices. And the first thing really to say about the so-called silent era is that in fact it wasn't silent at all, and silent films were kind of underpinned by this plethora of localized sounds, We had musical scores, sound effects, lecturers who interpreted films from beside the screen, and also live dubbing done by actors from behind the projection screen. And so, despite this emergence of a metaphor whereby silent cinema was deemed to be a kind of universal language, requiring therefore no translation, translation has in fact always been at the core of cinema and of the film industry. And filmmakers used intertitles to express dialogue, to drive the narrative, and the translation of these titles was integral to the project of cinema as this kind of global enterprise, I suppose. And often this translation was actually performed by film editors, by distributors, by cinema proprietors, by managers. And it wasn't necessarily simply a case of kind of removing the titles, translating them, and reinserting them. And I'm just going to show you a couple of clips which will give you a sense of why that process was in some ways far more kind of complicated even back then during the silent era. Okay, so this is a clip from Edwin S. Porter's College Chums. As you can see, there's very kind of creative, innovative use of titles even back then in 1907. And this next clip is another film that uses kind of superimposed titles. And the first part of the clip shows it in its kind of original format, and there's a kind of additional version which kind of highlights what happened to the film in translation and during later restorations when it had to be cut as a way of it was kind of a translation strategy, as a way of dealing with the superimposition of the titles. Okay, so as you can see, we have an instance there where, as a way of kind of, yeah, as I said, dealing with the translation issue, the linguistic difference there, and the superimposition, it comes down to the editing rather than necessarily the translation. So translation is kind of a part of film production, if you like. And besides these kind of linguistic elements of translation, there were also instances of cultural translation that impacted upon film production during this era. So in Japan, the benshi, who were kind of lecturers or interpreters who interpreted films, both local and international, for Japanese audiences, were kind of prevalent all the way up until the introduction of synchronized sound and even beyond. And often their role would be factored into the production of local Japanese films in such a way that filmmakers would allow time for the benshi to perform their role. So they would kind of linger on particular shots and just leave them that time for their performance. And another notable practice of cultural translation was the so-called Russian ending. This is where sort of culturally attuned filmmakers or producers, distributors, took into account a Russian preference for sad endings. And so up until 1917, non-Russian productions would have two endings. So that there would be a happy one for the domestic market, and then a sad one for the Russian distribution. So if we look at this whole kind of period, just sort of to summarize, film translation during the silent era can be considered more of a holistic process, I think, that involved the translation of intertitles, the omission and addition of titles, as well as film editing and even film production itself. Now, this all changed, obviously, with the introduction of the talkies, which heralded the arrival of kind of multilingualism on a worldwide scale. And as an early strategy to combat this, one of the early techniques was actually non-translation. So Hollywood producers and foreign distributors would create silent versions of talkies with music as the only sound, and then insert intertitles to kind of summarize the dialogue. This wasn't especially popular with local audiences, and so techniques were soon developed to kind of move beyond this. And I'd just touch upon two, which I think are kind of interesting to the whole discussion around the integration of language translation into filmmaking. So the first is the multilingual film, and the other is the multiple language version. So the multilingual film, this was an innovative strategy that placed language difference at the heart of a film's narrative in such a way that it would appeal to various linguistic audiences. And Niemann's Land, this film here, this was an anti-war film about 5 soldiers from different nations that kind of encounter one another during the First World War. And this was one of those such films. So in the film, 5 languages are spoken, but all without the aid of translation, so it has this kind of broad appeal. This is the, sorry, yeah, this is a Dutch print, so this does actually have the subtitles, and you can see here, even in this print here, they were kind of playing around with the placement of the titles and kind of being innovative in that way, even back then. The multiple language version, these were films that were made with the same technical crew, but with different casts shooting in a different language. And perhaps the most notable example was Todd Browning's Dracula, which starred Bela Lugosi in the title role in the English version, and Carlos Villarreal here on my left in the Spanish language version. So what happened is that Browning would be filming during the day in English, and then at night Melford, using the same sets and the same technical crew, would be filming with a different cast for the Spanish version. And these kinds of films, this multiple language version, they were also being made in India at this time, and interestingly, they're still being made today. And this is a recent kind of notable example of that, the Bahubali, which is a 2-part film series which has been shot simultaneously in Telugu and Tamil. In the European Hollywood context, however, ultimately the multiple language versions were unsuccessful and other translational modes were developed, namely subtitling and dubbing, which is kind of where we find ourselves today as these 2 dominant practices. And as they kind of took hold, the distribution arm of the whole process kind of gained greater control, really, over the translation, and filmmakers had less direct involvement. There are, and there have been, of course, many exceptions to this norm, and I will just limit myself to one because it is a particularly interesting one. So Stanley Kubrick, he was kind of heavily involved in decisions regarding the translation of his films, and it's worth briefly noting that kind of Kubrick, he had extensive conversations with his translators. He had a team of kind of language consultants that he called his brain trust, that he would kind of frequently consult with. And in correspondence to the head of European production at Columbia Pictures, Kubrick writes the following, and I think this is very pertinent to our discussion about the integration of translation accessibility. He writes, "I consider translation and dubbing of the film to be an intrinsic part of the artistic side of the production of a film." So it's kind of a precursor, if you like, to accessible filmmaking, I guess. So that, I hope, gives you a sense of the extent to which kind of early translational practices were integral to filmmaking, and of some of the ways in which filmmakers were involved in these practices. And I think I'd just like to end this section with a couple of kind of quotes from Carol O'Sullivan and Jean-François Cornu, who are two historians of audiovisual translation, and I think they summarize it well when they say that film translation encompasses all the conventional modes of the silent and talking periods. So that's subtitles, the lecturers, intertitles, dubbing, voiceover. But it is also more than any or all of these methods, and it cannot be reduced to the activity of translating applied to cinema. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, because the film translating profession actually developed within the film industry, rather than being a case of bringing translators working in other fields into the film production. And secondly, I think due to the kind of polysemiotic nature of film as a medium, and this is their words, to translate dialogue without taking into account its intrinsic relationship with the movement of images and the flow of sounds is impossible. And it's this intricate relationship I'd like to explore now by looking at what happens when we watch films and how that experience changes when we watch those films with subtitles, which will be the focus of the next part. I have a video now that I'd just like you all to watch. It's kind of it's called an awareness test. So there will be some instructions on the video, so if you just kind of pay attention and follow these instructions.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
Okay, so who got the right answer, first of all? Anyone? Yeah. And who saw the bear? No one. Okay. So what this video and what eye tracking research has revealed to us is this phenomenon known as inattentional blindness. And this is when we fail to notice fully visible kind of but unexpected objects because of our attention being directed elsewhere with other tasks, other events or objects. And this is the reason that, it's, by the sounds of it, all of you failed to see the moonwalking bear. And this is known as, as I said, this is known as inattentional blindness. So the question really is then, what happens when we watch films with subtitles, and how does this inattentional kind of blindness affect the way we watch them? Research suggests that subtitles kind of have a significant role in determining eye movements and visual attention, as you'd expect. And we know that the appearance of text on screen draws the viewer's attention to the subtitle kind of automatically, whether or not the subtitles are needed or even understood. So in other words, even when we don't speak the language of the subtitles, we are automatically drawn to reading those. It's kind of an impulse. And the same goes in many ways for any kind of text on screen. So it might be a street sign or a newspaper headline, for example, which means this kind of also has implications for filmmakers in their use of text on screen. And what this means is that if an important object or an important facial expression or gesture coincides with the appearance of a subtitle, the likelihood is that the viewer will be reading and not watching, which leads to another kind of blindness, and this has been called subtitling blindness. So I'd just like to explain some eye tracking research, which I hope will kind of elucidate this point a little bit. So this is research by Wendy Fox, who looked at the impact of subtitles placed in different positions on the screen. And so here we have, this is the viewer's eye movement watching a short film with no subtitles, so we can kind of see where they were looking. And next we have, sorry, yeah, this is the same clip, and this is with German subtitles placed in the standard position at the bottom of the screen. So here we can see the effect, obviously, that the subtitle has on the viewing patterns here. And then lastly, oh, sorry, I seem to, so I'm afraid I seem to have, misplaced the image, which will show you with the integrated subtitles that what you find is the integrated subtitle is placed kind of in between these two characters as they're speaking. And what Wendy Fox's research kind of indicates is that actually when you position the subtitles in this kind of custom, individually placed part on the screen, it allows the viewer more time to explore the rest of the image. There tends to be a correspondence between the viewing behavior and patterns of the viewer who is watching it without subtitles and that of the viewer who is watching it with the integrated subtitles. So, okay, so yeah, the point here really is that our viewing experiences are significantly altered when we watch films kind of in translation, and the focus here is obviously subtitling, but the same can be said about other modes of translation as well. And there are many factors to consider here. It's not just subtitling blindness and the placement of subtitles, but also the kind of appearance of subtitles can also affect the momentum, the visual momentum of our experience. So that's the kind of the speed at which we acquire the information. And there are other things that it's worth factoring in and being aware of when kind of making a film that you know is going to be subtitled. And this might be to do with legibility. So is there anything particularly important in this bottom part of the screen if you're going to have standard subtitles, or is there something in the composition of the frame that means there may be issues with legibility, such as kind of clothing or particular kind of backgrounds that make it difficult for the subtitles to be read? And I think this is where the collaboration between filmmakers and translation professionals, media access professionals, kind of comes in, and it's around having discussions about these potential issues and then possibly finding ways to kind of to sort of mitigate them, but also to explore the opportunities that something like creative subtitles might allow. So, accessible filmmaking. This is a quote by Pablo Romero Fresco, he's a researcher and a filmmaker. And this is how he defines accessible filmmaking: the consideration of translation and/or accessibility during the production of audiovisual media, normally through the collaboration between the creative team and the translator, in order to provide access to the content for people that cannot or cannot completely access them in their original form. So accessible filmmaking, as proposed this way, it's a framework really for allowing filmmakers to take into account what happens to their films in translation and accessibility. And practically speaking, as it's kind of set out here, it involves considering these different elements during various stages filmmaking process. And I'll set this out kind of in more detail when I discuss the Italian short film. But Romero Fresco makes three kind of key arguments as to why he thinks successful filmmaking is an important initiative. And the first one is kind of economic. And he says, based on the fact that the highest grossing films earn, on average, over half of their revenue from foreign language versions, yet a fraction of that budget is spent on the translation and access, he feels there's a kind of imbalance. And also that it makes sense, given that you know a large proportion of the audience is going to be watching these films in translation or potentially access. The second argument he makes concerns quality, and he thinks that the lack of investment in translation and access and the subsequent absence of collaboration between filmmakers, translation and access professionals has led to a decline in what he calls quality. And the third argument concerns creativity. And he asserts that a lack of input from filmmakers in translation and media access results in a lack of creativity. And it's on this final point that I'd like to kind of focus, and it's through that kind of lens of creativity that I'd like to discuss the short film, the Italian short film. But before we quickly do that, I think one of the reasons that accessible filmmaking is potentially interesting, but also kind of worth considering, is that not only does it provide filmmakers with a greater awareness of how their films are treated, changed, experienced in translation and access, but it also offers translation and access professionals new insights into these films that they're working on, and it allows them to question their own practices, and also to question conventions that are kind of put to them by the industry. And the reason I think this process is can be so fruitful in a kind of disruptive but also very creative and productive sense is that filmmakers often have an entirely different perspective, not only on their own film, but also with regard to how translation and access might be approached. And I recall a conversation I had a few years ago with a very experienced audio describer in the UK who was a visiting lecturer at Roehampton at the time. And he said that the only time his work was really queried was when he was working on small productions, and he was able to discuss the audio description with the director. And he said that's because the directors always kind of ask questions, and they always have queries. You know, why have you described this? What about this? I think this is more of a priority. And this is precisely kind of the reason accessible filmmaking can be such a kind of productive process, I think, is because it's the bringing together of these two kind of different perspectives. And this is what happened on a recent film called Notes on Blindness, whose translation and accessibility was kind of approached in a collaborative and dynamic way earlier on in the filmmaking process. And I'd just like to give you a clip of the subtitles that were kind of produced as a result of that collaborative process.
They offered to send me to the rehabilitation centre. There were special holiday homes for blind people. Maybe I'd like to have a dog.
And she said, well, you need a mobility course.
I say, no, I'm not doing that. I haven't got time.
I mean, most people would have made the time.
I was just too busy keeping up with everything.
Well, you were also stubborn. You were sort of in furious denial.
The only thing I was interested in was how to function as a blind academic. That nobody knew.
The Long Surrender, Autumn Conquest, Blue Sky.
I needed to have serious books recorded sensibly. What about anthropology and sociology. All that was basically available in the United Kingdom was detective novels and romantic fiction. Well, I'm interested in reading contemporary social sciences. No, look, how do blind people read big books? They said they don't. Anyway, I'll sort it out, so thanks for your advice. They don't. That was it. I didn't buy that.
Okay. So, obviously, as you can see, what we have here is an approach that kind of moves beyond convention. It moves beyond a question only of content, and it starts to consider form as well, tone and aesthetics, shot composition. So it's really kind of moving things forward in that sense. And in many ways, this was due to the filmmaker's interests in a kind of alternative audiences, I suppose. And in my experience of working with filmmakers to date, not only have I found them to be kind of deeply interested in what happens to their films in translation and access when kind of made aware of the process, but also their input has always offered kind of fresh perspectives. And I'd now like to briefly share with you a glimpse of the recent fieldwork on this Italian short film, Aquario, by Lorenzo Pontoni, which I hope will kind of illustrate firstly how the practice this works, but also, as I said, some of the challenges and some of the kind of innovations, I think. So, yeah. Ooh. So this was the film. I was working on this film as a director of access and translation, and I became involved because I was looking for a kind of PhD pilot project. So I started working as this director of access, overseeing the production of the accessible and the translated versions of the film. So you can see, I mean, there wasn't a great deal, but we had English and French subtitles and also audio description subtitles for viewers with hearing impairments and kind of creative versions of those. And I'll just explain kind of how it worked, really. So initially we had a sort of consultation process. So as the director of access in the sort of development pre-production stage, I consulted with the producers and with the director, Lorenzo, regarding the accessible versions, and then Lorenzo and I discussed the screenplay, the storyboard, the film's treatment, and started thinking about different ways of approaching the different accessible versions. And we then, during the post-production, we had I recruited an audio describer and a subtitler, and we had an initial draft of each version created on the back of a rough cut, so before the film was locked. And then we had a meeting with Lorenzo, with the kind of subtitler, Lorenzo and myself, to discuss the different kind of challenges, opportunities, and likewise with the audio describer. And then we waited until the film was locked and we had a final cut of the film, and then this again was sent to the subtitler, to the audio describer, and a similar process kind of took place. They worked again on this final version, and we had another meeting with Lorenzo just to get his feedback on the second versions. And then finally, once we thought we had a kind of a pretty much final version, we worked with a company in Viterbo here in Italy, and we worked with consultants, viewers with sensory impairment. So there was a couple of blind consultants and one sort of deaf consultant who gave us their input into the film, into their experience of the film, as a way of kind of it's a sort of a form of quality control in a way, looking at issues of comprehension potentially. And so that was that was more or less the process. So after the consultation, we had the production of the final versions, which happened, once the film was finished during the kind of distribution. So there's kind of more work during certain stages, but it's this ongoing kind of iterative drafting and kind of creative process. So I'd just like to talk now about kind of 3 or 4 moments in the film, which I think will give you a sense of the sort of inner workings of what happens when a film director and a subtitler or an audio describer kind of come together. Okay, so let's just see if this clip plays. This clip kind of happens about 4 or 5 minutes into the film, and it's a sort of pivotal moment. So the film begins with a shot of an eye peeping through a hole in the wall at a young woman in the changing room, and the person to whom this eye belongs is unknown to the viewer at this point. But from this moment onwards, the eye and the camera kind of become one, and we follow the young woman as she swims underwater into the pool, and she sort of playfully encourages both the viewer and the subject to follow her. And so this has been kind of going on for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then this moment in the film happens. Okay, so I think if we've still got time, I'd just like to talk to you about 2 aspects related to this moment here. The first is connected to the subtitles, and the second to the audio description. So the moment here in which the bullet kind of penetrates the young woman's head was initially a point of contention between the director and the subtitler, because the subtitler wanted to kind of highlight the silent nature of the gunshot. And so she initially wrote a subtitle that read "Sparo non udibile," which we might translate as "inaudible gunshot." And this is kind of quite common in subtitles for viewers with hearing impairments to kind of highlight the inaudibility of certain sounds. But the issue here was that the director, in his view, he was concerned that the viewers were going to be forced to read the subtitle as opposed to kind of stay with the image. So eventually the decision here was made to kind of non-translate, if you like, to non-subtitle, to avoid this notion of subtitling blindness that I was talking about earlier. And the second talking point was this was interesting. This was about the point of view of the audio description. So typically audio describers are required to produce a kind of objective description that's written in the third person. But Lorenzo felt that this approach didn't do justice to the language of the film, and he suggested that it was written in from a sort of second person point of view, which is fairly unusual in the world of audio description. And so, although our audio describer was kind of slightly wary of doing this, she wrote the description, and following discussions with Lorenzo and with the sound editor and the consultants, we had a kind of a final version that was ready to be produced. And we worked with a producer from Rai here in Italy who helped us find a voice actor and the studio space. And he hadn't actually had a chance to read the script before the before the session began, but he was present during the recording. And as soon as we started recording the first line of the script, he was like, whoa, 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 what the fuck did you just say? And he was kind of completely flabbergasted by this point of view shift. And it took a bit of explaining on the point of view on the part of Lorenzo and myself, but eventually he kind of came around to this idea, and we recorded the audio description. So I think this just gives you a kind of glimpse, I think, of some of the dynamics of how this collaborative process kind of can unfold, and it can be both challenging and productive, I think, in a creative sense. And there are many different avenues that are being explored in terms of creative approaches at the moment, particularly in media access. These are just kind of a few of them, really. And so before I kind of just wrap up, I'd like to share with you a few quotes from film directors on their experience of working collaboratively or of being exposed to the accessible versions of their films. And I think I have a slide here. So the first quote, this comes from the directors of Notes on Blindness, which was the film that I showed you with the creative subtitles. So, and this is what they said about their kind of experience. It's strange to think that a process is so crucial to the experience of a film, for so much of its audience is often an afterthought, produced without the involvement of the filmmakers who are so creatively involved in every other aspect of the film. Integrating the accessibility process into the post-production schedule stops it from being a rushed afterthought, allows for redrafting and reworking, which is, of course, so essential to any creative process. The second quote comes from a film director with whom I worked on another short film project, and he felt that working in this way really gave him a kind of a new lens with which he could see his own film through, really. And he said, as a storyteller, as a director, it deepened my experience of the story in the film. And the last one comes from Marcello Toledo, and this was about his experience of watching his film audio described. And he said, it allowed me to see the film not as I had imagined it, but as the film actually appears. And unusually, I was able to become a viewer of my own life. Or for the first time, sorry, I was able to become a viewer of my own film. And so just to come full circle, kind of as it were, thinking about what happened with Cuarón's Roma, I think film translation and access, it doesn't necessarily need to be viewed as this, solution to a problem, to an issue. And I don't think accessible filmmaking necessarily needs to be kind of viewed in this way either. That is, a way of kind of mitigating damage or of ensuring quality. But actually, I think translation and in particular accessibility can maybe be seen as a cinematic tool and also as a creative opportunity for filmmakers. And that's everything. So thanks very much for listening. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. We might have run over slightly.
I don't know if you have time for questions. Possibly not, but we will be around, and I'm sure you'll be available for questions. I found it very interesting. I don't agree on everything you said, because in my experience in film translation involving filmmakers can be a nightmare sometimes. Oh, yeah. And I have some recollection of it, working in Venice with film directors that wanted, the real reason why they were so involved in the translation is that they didn't trust the fact that they want to protect the copyright of their film, so they didn't allow us to work alone at any time, and they were always present during all the process of translation. But that, of course, is different because we were talking about very last minute of the distribution phase. And I think what I believe is really interesting is that filmmakers have to be aware of the constraints of translation and making the film available to different audiences. And so the fact that they are exposed to this definitely from the beginning of the process is definitely important. And then in the end, of course, the choice is theirs, but it's particularly, I think it's really a good thing that they know how we see films, and the eye tracking research is, I think, is very illuminating. And the test about the bear. Of course, I saw it before, so I saw the bear this time. But I found it's particularly interesting because, of course, subtitles can also be destructive in a way, and we know that even if we know the language and we don't need any help in terms of impairments, but if there are subtitles over the image, we actually tend to see. We tend to read them even if we don't need them. And also, eye tracking technology, I know, showed us that in the watching the video, watching a film at the cinema, we just see anytime the 3% of all the image we see. So it's a really, really a very small part of all the image that filmmaker developed. And of course, if there are also subtitles, that 3% can become 1%. So it's a matter that has to be taken into consideration. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll be around if you have any questions. And I hope you are among us. There's the winner of the awards we're giving away tomorrow, which means actually subtitling in a number of languages, and audio description, and subtitle for the hard of hearing for the films that are part of the competition here. Thank you. And thank you.
Thanks.